A very good afternoon to all. As it is said, there must be a great beginning for great things to happen. The urge to learn takes us towards lofty heights. The Department of Computer Science of KCW understands this and takes requisite steps from time to time to provide learning platforms to its students and faculty. Today, we have amongst us a programmer analyst whose experience and expertise will help us in getting know-how of REST API. Representational state transfer API is an architectural style and approach to communications often used in web services development. REST used by browsers can be thought of as a language of internet. REST is a logical choice for building APIs that allow users to connect to, manage, and interact with cloud services flexibility in a distributed environment. It's a matter of immense pride for the entire KCW fraternity that its very own alumni, Ms. Rachita Dua, has graced today's occasion as a resource person. She has earned acclaim within a short span of time with her out-of-the-box ideas. She has done BCA from KCW, Ludhiana, and MCA from National Institute of Technology, Karnataka. She has worked at Coffee Table Ludhiana for 3 years and then moved to Canada. She is currently working as a programmer analyst at Flagship Courier Solutions, Point Claire in Montreal. We are indeed honored to have such a versatile personality amongst us, whose presence will prove to be highly inspirational for our dear students. I deem it my honor to welcome you to this e-platform. I seize the privileged opportunity to thank our dear principal ma'am, whose motivational presence inspires us to take initiatives and contribute maximum in shaping the for a better tomorrow. Students, this is to inform you that please keep it in mind that you have to fill your feedback come attendance form during the session. The link for the same will be sent in the chat box. So please be attentive to mark your attendance, as only then each certificates will be given to you. Now, without much ado, let us all gain many things from the experience and the expertise of the speaker of the day. I request Ms. Rachita to enlighten us on the topic of workshop.
Thank you, ma'am. I'll just share my screen so we can get started with the presentation. So today's workshop is on RESTful APIs. But what exactly is a RESTful API? REST is basically an acronym for Representational State Transfer, and it is an architectural style for distributed hypermedia systems. So what exactly does this mean? What do you mean by distributed hypermedia systems? It basically means that you have hypermedia systems that are distributed all over the globe. And when I say hypermedia, you can think of it as a website. Let's take the example of Facebook and Instagram. Facebook itself is a hypermedia system. It has text, videos, audios, images, all sorts of HTTP media. The same applies to Instagram, Pinterest, and you can name any number of websites. All of these, they have their servers distributed throughout the globe. That is what makes it a distributed hypermedia system. The second thing that is very important when we talk about RESTful APIs is the state. What exactly do you mean by state? When I say state, it means all the information that we pass on with the request. And HTTP is a stateless protocol, which means that with every request, I will have to transfer all the information. I cannot have the information from the previous request saved and expect that to be available for my next request. So why exactly should we use REST or RESTful APIs? Let's say that you have a website of your own and you wish to display on your website how many Facebook likes you have, how many people have liked your Instagram posts, and stuff like that. So, to access an external database, we make use of RESTful APIs. You cannot expect Facebook to allow you to use their database or write to it or even read from it from that matter because it's sensitive information. So what we do is they have their RESTful APIs, they have the documentation for that, and we can use a token or some sort of a URI to access certain information from their database without actually hitting the database. What I mean by that is that we won't be hitting their database, we will only hit their API, and their API will communicate with the database and get us the information back. So there are 6 guiding principles for RESTful API. The first is client server. It's basically the case for every internet-based request that you have a client that will send a request and a server that will process that request. Statelessness, as explained, every request will contain all the information that is required for the server to understand that request, and you cannot take advantage of any stored information. So no information will be stored on the server from the previous request. The third principle is cacheable. There are cache constraints that are required by the data for each and every request. So you have the option of caching a response. Again, please be very clear about this. Statelessness and cacheable are 2 different aspects. So when I say statelessness, that means that we're talking about a request. And when I say cacheable, we are talking about a response. So please be clear about that. Then you need to have a uniform interface for all your requests when you're using REST. So there are 4 interface constraints: identification of resources, manipulation of resources through representations, self-descriptive messages, and hypermedia as the engine of application state. So you need to identify what all resources you will be using in your request. You need to know how you are going to manipulate those resources so as to present the response. The messages should be self-descriptive, which means that when I read a message, I should be able to understand it. There should be no encoding or cumbersome keywords or anything. It should be very self-explanatory. And you should know which hypermedia you're going to use. Then it is a layered system, which allows you which allows the architecture to be composed of several layers. So, like in networking, in the network models, you have layers. Similar to that in HTTP or in request or in REST, it is a layered system. And the last one is an optional guiding principle, which says code on demand. So whatever request and response you're getting, it is up to you whether you want to share the code for that. I hope the guiding principles are clear. I'll take all your questions at the end of the presentation. So please be prepared with that. Now, what exactly is a request? What's a response? And what are the methods that are used in REST? So a request is basically a URI or a URL that we send the data to, if there is any data. We'll discuss about that in a while. And whatever information you get back, that is called a response. There are 5 main methods that are used with REST. The first one is get. It basically is used to perform a read operation on the database. So you with the get method, you send a request. It hits the API, fetches the data from the database, and gives you that data in whatever requested format. Post is basically to create a new record on the database. Put and patch they're quite similar to each other, and they're used for update operation. Delete is used to delete a record from the database. So if you see that these 4 methods basically cover all the CRUD operations. CRUD means create, read, update, and delete. So to create a new record, you use post. To read, you use get. To update, you will use put or patch. And to delete, you will use the delete method. Moving forward, almost throughout REST, throughout the world, most of the REST requests are using JSON. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. There are certain platforms that use other languages, but JSON is the most widely accepted language for requests and responses in a REST API. Now, what exactly is JSON and how we can use it? It is, like I said, JavaScript Object Notation. It is a lightweight and text-based data interchange format. So it is very light. A file of about, let's say, 100 lines would hardly be 1 KB in JSON. It would definitely be less than 1 KB, right? And it is text-based. It is very easily understandable. And when we say data interchange format, that means that data can be interchanged through it very easily. It is completely language independent. So whether you are programming in PHP or Python or Java or any language, you can use JSON. It is not dependent that you have to use JavaScript or Java to use it. You can use it with absolutely any language. And it is based on a subset of JavaScript programming language. Even though it uses JavaScript in the sense that it is formatted pretty much similar to how JavaScript syntaxes work, but it is not dependent on JavaScript. And it is very easy to understand and manipulate and generate. So a JavaScript object notation is basically a set of key value pairs. It's an unordered set of key value pairs. I'll use a couple of examples later. It begins with the left brace and ends with the right brace, and each name or key is followed by a colon. And every name value or key value pair is separated by a comma. So this is an example of a JavaScript object. You have var, that's a keyword, and the name of the object. Whatever data you assign is going to be in curly braces. The employee ID is the first key, and the value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is the first value. As you see, the key is a string. It is in double quotes, And the value, it can be anything. It can be a string or an integer. It can be any value without you having to assign a data type to it. Pretty much the same way, the next key value pair is name, Jeff Fox, hire date, 1st January 2013, location, Norwalk, consultant, false. So based on this, most of you would have guessed that certain data types that are available in JavaScript are string, integer, and Boolean. There are others available, but these are the main ones. So I've added another key value pair in this object. It's the same object, but I've added an array over here. So just to give you an example, if you look at the last key value pair, 4 numbers, it's an array. So arrays, pretty much like any other programming language, they are in square brackets. So just to give you a recap on JavaScript object notation or JSON, you have a key value pair, and each key value pair is part of the object. Every key value pair in the object will be separated by a comma. So let's take the example of a REST API now. I will take an example from the GitHub API. So if you have the GitHub API, the endpoint is https api.github.com. Whenever you are trying to use an API for whichever platform it may be, it could be Facebook's API or GitHub or Twitter's API, you will always have a documentation available. When I say endpoint, this is the request URL or URI that we discussed earlier. Now, a very basic example, GitHub's API documentation says that to get a list of all the repositories for a user, I will access this link, https api.github.com users, that's my username, RADUA, repos, and type all. When I say type all, in this URI, I'll just break this down a little bit so it's easier for you to understand. Now, the endpoint in this API is https api.github.com users radua repos. That's all. Everything before the question mark is the endpoint. The method is get. The parameters are whatever is given after the question mark. So in this case, parameters are type all. If there were multiple parameters, they would be separated by an ampersand sign, pretty much the same way as is the case in an HTTP request that you do on an internet browser. And there is no body type. In most of the cases, it's not always the case, but most of the cases, a GET request won't have a body. I hope this is clear moving forward. So what exactly comprises of a request? You need to have an endpoint or a URL. That will be your request URL, a method, which can be get, post, put, or patch, or delete. You need to have certain headers. We'll discuss headers in a bit. And you need to have some data or a body of the request. Now, data is optional. When we talk about headers, let's say that your request has some data to it. It has a body, and that body you're using JSON to describe the data in that body. So in that case, one of the headers would be context type, and its value will be application/JSON. So this is just a description of what we have already discussed. Like it says over here, headers are property value pairs that are separated by a colon, and your headers are generally in JSON. Let's take another example. We have the countries API. So if you go to this link, I'll give you all a moment to copy the link, https://restcountries.eu/rest/vu/all. So if you go to this link, you will see a list of all the countries in the world. And before that, you will see 0, and there's going to be an object. So if you realize it's 0, 1, 2, 3, all these are part of an array. That is why it has the index next to it, and every index corresponds to a JavaScript object. So if you just do a control F to search for it, just search for India, and I have the object with me over here, and we can discuss this. I hope all of you have the object in front of you right now. If not, please focus on the slide and we'll discuss this. So the first one says name India. Like I said, this is a key value pair, right? Top level domain is in an array. We get this information that this is an array because it is in square brackets. Alpha 2 code, Alpha 3 code, etc. All these things. This is basically one JavaScript object which has a lot of data in it, and all the data is of different types. The data types are different. All the keys are strings, and all the values can either be arrays, strings, integers, or Boolean values. I hope this is clear. Moving forward, we will now take an example of a post request. So if you go to this, let's just go to this URL. Just give me 1 second and I'll share my browser. I hope all of you can see my browser. So to create a repository for the authenticated user, like I said, whichever API you will try to use, it will always have some documentation to it. And it is very important that you go through the documentation before you start using the API. It will give you a very good understanding of the API and how you are supposed to use it. So it says that you can set the visibility of the repository. So now we know that there is a visibility parameter with this request. I will simply come to the table over here. So to create a new repository for an authenticated user, you use the post method, and the route or the endpoint is going to be /user/repos. Now, when we say that the route is /user/repos, it means that you will have the endpoint before it. And the endpoint for the GitHub API, as we discussed, is https api.github.com. So the complete endpoint is going to be https api.github.com/user/repos. So if you're using OAuth, then you need to have certain authorizations in place. We are not going to discuss OAuth in this presentation. Maybe we'll have another presentation for that some other time. So when you're creating a repository, there are certain parameters. If you remember, parameters are passed with a question mark, and all parameters are separated by an ampersand sign. So the name, you need to pass the name of the repository. The value is going to be a string. You need to have a description, which will be a short description of the repository. The name is a required field. The description does not say it's required, so that means that it is an optional field. You can pass a home page. You can pass a Boolean value, whether you want the repository to be private or public. If it's set to true, it's going to be a private repository, and if it is set to false, it's going to be a public repository. Visibility has issues. When we say issues, that means that you are creating issues along with creating the repository. So at the same time, you're creating issues. Again, it's a Boolean value. I just want to bring your attention to the team ID. This is an integer value. So when you're passing an integer value in JSON, you do not put it in quotes. I will take the example that we had a while back. Just 1 second. Yeah. So if you look over here, when we talk about the population, this is an integer value and we don't put it in quotes. Only strings are put in quotes. Okay, so I hope that you are clear with the post request. This will basically create a record in GitHub's database. It will create a repository for whichever user has authenticated the request. And when that user will list his repositories on GitHub, it will be available. Now we'll talk about response codes. So every time you send a request, you get a response back. And every response is associated with a response code. There is always a response code. It may be possible that you don't return a text response, but you have to return a response code. This is true for your HTTP requests as well. When I say HTTP request, I mean the request that you send in your browser. Like, let's say sometimes you try to access a website and you get a page in a website and you get a 404, which is a page not found error. So the 404 is not found error. The 404 over there is the response code. Some of the most common response codes are 200, which means that the request was successful. 200 OK. 201 created, which means that the post request was successful and the record has been created. 400 bad request means that there was a bad input parameter and the error message should indicate which one and why. So when you return a 400 response, you should indicate, or in your text response, you should mention that which parameter was bad and what is the expected value. Let's say that in my API, I want the name to be of length 15 characters and the user has input 20 characters. So in my response, the response code should be 400 and the text should say that name value is too long. Please restrict it to 15 characters. 401 unauthorized. That means that the user who is trying to make the request is not authorized to make this request. You can think of it as user permissions. 403 is forbidden. Again, this is very similar to 401, but the difference is with 401, think of it as user roles, and 403, this is more like permissions. So 404 is not found, 405 is method not allowed. Let's say that you're trying to use get method with a request that needs a post method. So it's going to specify that you're using the wrong HTTP method. And it is a good practice for you to mention that which is the correct method. 500 is an internal state error and 503 is service unavailable. If you want to read more about response codes, there's a very good documentation given on Mozilla's developer help page. Like we discussed CRUD, it's basically create, read, update, and delete. Create is done using the post method, read is done with the get method, update is done with the put or patch, and delete is done with the delete method. So wrapping up, what exactly should be the code structure? You can write a REST API in almost any language, absolutely any language. Whichever language you prefer or you like, you can write a REST API in that. So what exactly would you need to write a REST API? You need to create a database. You need to be able to connect to a database. You need to define your routes. Now your route will have an endpoint and the remaining portion of the route. Like we discussed in case of GitHub post request, it was https api.github.com/user/repos. That is your route, including the endpoint. Then you need to create objects for tables because these objects are going to communicate with the database. And you need to get results from your database, and then you need to format that result in whichever way you want to present your response. And that's the end of it. I'll take your questions now. Okay, if you have any questions, please post it in the YouTube chat.
Stu- Students, if you have any query, then please put it in your chat box.
So I guess that completes the presentation.
Students, please feel free to ask your queries if you have. Ma'am, somebody is asking that is there any particular course about this?
I don't think there's a particular course, but you can always look up for tutorials on the internet and you'll get a good understanding of the topic. If you want to develop any REST APIs, you can just create a database depending on your programming language. Let's say you want to use PHP for this. So you will get a good enough tutorial to write a simple PHP REST API. Generally, you use frameworks for writing REST APIs. One of the most common frameworks is PHP is Symfony, but there are no particular courses about this. Okay, so the scope of REST APIs is basically to get information or to communicate with an external database. It can be anything, and when we talk about the dimensions, it is very, very wide. So you can connect with almost any database in the world which has a REST API for it.
Students, if you have any other query, then please put it in chat box.
Yes, you can write a REST API in any language of your choice. It is generally used with internet languages, programming languages, in the sense that you can use PHP, Python, uh, React, Angular, any such internet programming language to write a REST API.
Thank you, Rachita, for such an informative session. Successful culmination of an event is not a solitary task. It requires collaborative efforts, I, on behalf of the Department of Computer Science, express my humble gratitude towards Ms. Rachita for sharing her valuable inputs. Your motivational talk and deliberation has definitely opened new platforms for students, which they will make use in their near future. Thank you for illuminating their path with your knowledge. We are indeed indebted to dear Principal Ma'am for helping us in all our endeavors. I express my humble gratitude towards our head of the department, Dr. Parminder Kaur, under whose directions this workshop has been organized. I also thank our dear students for always being patient listeners. Thank you, one and all. Students, kindly fill the feedback form if you have not filled it yet. Only then the e-certificates will be given to you. Thank you so much. Thank you, one and all.
Thank you.